I didn't do my hair today. Let's talk about the White Lotus. So, a lot of people who watched this season of the White Lotus left it feeling dissatisfied or like there were broken promises, things that we should have seen. They felt a little empty. So, let's talk about why you are feeling dissatisfied with the season of the White Lotus and some of the reasons that may have contributed to it, and whether some of those were deliberate or not, because I think several of them were. Let's get into it. By the way, there are so many spoilers coming. Everything is spoiled. So if you don't want season 3 of The White Lotus spoiled, you've been warned. The biggest one that I think is a genuine mistake instead of being a character choice is this. We were told things instead of being shown them. Now, the biggest example I have of this is in Rick and Chelsea's relationship, and the reason why it's so prominent is because their story becomes the tragic arc of the entire season. So, when we first meet Rick and Chelsea, Rick is a jerk, he sucks, and Chelsea is very supportive of him, very kind to him, infallibly and gullibly so. And we see Rick kind of starting fights or just being contentious with Jason Isaacs. We see him being unpleasant around the resort. And we see her being fun, nice, and sweet. So by the time Rick heads to Bangkok, I personally did not care about him at all. I figured he was going to go meet his father. I didn't want it to go well for him. The only reason I wanted him to come back safely was because I cared about Chelsea. But Rick's well-being was not a priority to me. After he spent some time with Sam Rockwell, I began feeling warmer toward him, partially just because Sam Rockwell was so bonkers that like that whole storyline became fun. But because we didn't see any of Rick being a supportive partner, any of Rick being kind, any of the reason why Rick may have appealed to Chelsea before he left for Bangkok, we were stuck feeling very little warmth toward him. We only began to understand pieces of their relationship when Chelsea told us why she cared about Rick in episodes 6 and 7. So at that point, we've gone so long feeling a lack of attachment to him, and then when we are given a reason to feel more attached to him, it's told to us instead of shown. We do not get to watch it happen. We do not get to see him treating Chelsea well until the very last episode. Whereas if they had shown us that Rick was in love with Chelsea, that Rick was a good partner in ways but a deeply flawed individual, then we could understand that this was headed to a dangerous place, but be hurting for the inevitability of it and rooting for Rick to pull himself out of that. Instead, I wasn't really invested in him at all until the end, and the only reason I cared was her. And we had to take her word for it that he was a good partner, that he was someone who she really loved, and we ultimately at that point didn't know if she was an unreliable narrator and if she was a cautionary tale in some way, or if she was actually talking about a side to Rick that we just hadn't seen at that point. So it led us to feel unsure about our status with him, even when we were being told all the reasons he was good. Now, I don't know if this is true or if this is just me reading into something, but Sam Rockwell's presence was an interesting aspect that felt like it took Rick away from his central storyline with Chelsea. Because in bringing Sam Rockwell in, we had basically 2 full episodes of Sam Rockwell being nuts, which was so fun. Like his somersaults down the hallway, his entire monologue, all of those things were fantastic. But were they really in service of Walton Goggins' storyline? I think not. I think they were much more a thing that 2 buds got to do that was super fun. But I would have liked to have seen some of the screen time that went to Sam Rockwell's character instead devoted to Chelsea and Rick's relationship, and then squeeze the Sam Rockwell stuff a little closer to the end so that we could still have the fun of that character, but not have it detract from our opportunity to connect with our central relationship here. Number 2. So I'm torn if this was deliberate or accidental or a combination of both, so I'm putting it here with that caveat. We wanted payoffs that we didn't get. So one of the big ones that I saw people tweeting about and talking about all over the place was the, oh, sorry. I can't make it happen on purpose, but by accident, it sure does. So one of the big ones I saw was Victoria's relationship or lack thereof with Kate. So Kate came up to the table and is like, hey, I knew you from that baby shower. And Victoria pretends to not know her, pretends to have not been there. And we assume that there's some kind of history there. We assume it might be ugly. We assume it might tie into one of them having a dirty past, and nothing comes of it. So I see that it was just an opportunity for us to learn a bit that Victoria is a real snob, that she doesn't deign to associate with other people. But it didn't feel like it fully contributed to our understanding of her character. It felt like it was a flag leading to something, and it didn't. Similarly, it felt like we were getting a setup to something with Greg/Gary and the Ratliff boys, and I fully did not trust the story that he wanted to watch his lady get with somebody else until the very final moments of the final episode. I thought that was a setup the entire time. And this show is designed to keep you on edge so that you inherently distrust every single piece of information as it's presented to you. But it just felt like that was headed somewhere much more nefarious. And I was left really confused about his intentions, because we know he was blackmailing Belinda to keep quiet. Like, we know he was a bad dude, especially with what we know he did to Tanya. And that little piece of nuance there felt odd. It felt a little confusing. Yeah, that there's no other way to say that. A big one that I thought was headed somewhere and didn't was Jacqueline and Valentine. So when he slept with a famous actress and was a part of a crime ring, I was positive that there was going to be some storyline of extortion, of blackmail, of that there was a tape of it, that he had proof of it. She's a married famous actress and he is a known criminal. It really seemed like a full setup for something. And when nothing happened with that, I felt let down in the relationship between the three women, because I was wanting to be fed something from that storyline with the Russians. And I understand completely that the storyline for the three women was about their friendship and was about their relationship with each other. But I had wanted to see what was going to happen there. And that ties into just the Russian crime situation in general. I just thought there was going to be more something for that, whether they struck again, whether we saw some kind of payback from all of that, or whether we saw it bite somebody else. It just seemed like there was so much left undone with this knowledge that there were violent criminals actively infiltrating the hotel. And it made me wonder where that was going to go, what that was going to be. And when it ended in nothing, it felt a little like I wanted something more there. Then the Ratliff family and their money issues was a final one. That this one I can understand the justification that this was 100% by choice, which was that Tim hyped this thing up to be so terrible that it would be worth offing his entire family. And he was dead serious about going through with it. He thought that his life was truly over. And then when they all looked at their phones and saw that something was wrong, they all just kind of went, huh. Now, this, as I said, is the one that I can most closely argue was deliberate, because the takeaway I had from that is the idea that the wealthy are inherently spared from consequences, and that somehow everyone is going to be fine from this. And also that he was making himself crazy over his belief about how things were going to go, when actually the final shakeout was a non-event. I feel like that's very true to life, and that was a very interesting piece of commentary. But the other started moments that lacked a payoff, I think contributed to a lot of people who watched this season feeling unsatisfied, or feeling like there was a disconnect between what they thought was going to happen and what actually happened. Into the next point, which is promises versus results. I think we were promised a show that was very different from what we got, and I am not mad at the show we got, but I think there was a space to get ahead of this in the promises. So let's talk about it. In the final episode of the final season, Mike White talked about how he viewed this season as a Greek tragedy. And in a lot of ways, it followed the tenets of a Greek tragedy. We had a tragic hero who we watched inevitably succumb to a downfall that brought others down with him. So I'm talking Rick and Chelsea. And we understood to some extent that his fall was inevitable, and watching it happen was frustrating and ultimately was a commentary on the human experience. We also had in Chelsea a little bit of the prophecy and foretelling. It's a big part of Greek mythology. She kept saying bad things happen in threes, and often in a Greek tragedy, we will have some sort of prophecy or some sort of seer who comes in and lays out what's going to happen. So she told us there were going to be 3 deaths. We got our 3 deaths. She told us that something really bad was going to happen, and she was correct. So she was acting as the prophet throughout this story. But because this was season 3 of an established TV show, we were sold a whodunit. Because seasons 1 and 2 felt more like, okay, somebody died and we're going to have to figure out who did it. Whereas this season was, you pretty much inevitably knew who was going to die. And instead of figuring out who did it and how it was going to happen, we just had to watch the inevitable descent and see the choices that brought us here. I love that as a format, and I love the idea of taking a show that's been done a certain kind of way and turning it on its ear a little bit. But I would have loved if we had a little more tipping of the hand that this is what was going to happen, because I think it would have spared people that feeling of ugh when it ended and they had expected a slightly different show. And I don't know how to do this, because if you truly marketed season 3 as a Greek tragedy, you are telling people how it ends, and some people are really adverse to that. I could also see HBO liking the clickability of the whodunit aspect, of the who's dead, what do we think happened, of the more traditional murder mystery storyline. So do you sacrifice that hypeability for the reality of what kind of a show you're getting? I assume that they would argue that because people love this show and because it's in its 3rd season, they're willing to sacrifice the true meaning of the story in order to get more eyeballs on it, and they trust that good faith is going to carry people into watching a 4th season should they make it, which they probably will, and I hope they make it in snow. But I would have loved even more overt mirroring of the Greek tragedy, so even more overt presentation of where this story was going to go and us watching it so that we could truly go on the experience of descent that we get in a Greek tragedy. But I don't know, maybe I just love sadness. All right, the last one is 100%, well, I'm not Mike White, I think is a big part on purpose. It's the idea of wants versus needs. So anybody who has written a story or gone through any preliminary like screenwriting or short story course or anything like that knows the concept of a character's want versus a character's need. So a character's want is what they want. It's what they think they need, basically. And a character's need is what they actually need in order to complete their character arc, go on some kind of journey, grow as a person. Often the want is more superficial than the need, or the want is more easily achieved than the need. Sometimes the want is in conflict with the need, and we as an audience understand the need and know that the character needs to learn that their want isn't actually beneficial for them, and instead they need their need. So we had a couple of examples of characters who presented a want and we understood their need and we watched them not achieve their need. Now, this to me is one of the tenets of the White Lotus, so I am nearly positive that this was done completely deliberately and is part of the final takeaway. So the first one is Lori. Lori, we all understood, this is Carrie Coon's character. We all understood that Lori had a lot of needs. Lori needed to find peace in her own situation. She needed to stand up for herself against her mean girlfriends. She needed a self-esteem boost. She needed to find some peace in her life. She needed a lot of things. Her final speech on the last night in the last episode expresses her want. And it feels arresting because that want is not what her need is. Her want was to be at the table with her friends. She was saying to them, I'm happy you're beautiful. I'm happy you have a beautiful life. I just want to be included. And that is her want, and that has been her want. But we as an audience feel sorry for her because we feel she has not recognized her need. She needs to come into her own. She needs to take ownership. She needs to find things in herself. And instead, she's still looking for that validation externally from the people who have, in large part, made her miserable up until this point in her life. Number 2 is Belinda. So Belinda came into this episode or into this season wanting and needing to decompress, to learn something new, to heal, and to bring a new knowledge back to her practice. She was in a full reset and detox mode. And for the first half of the season, we really were getting that for Belinda. Then, once the payoff situation entered, Belinda suddenly wanted the money. Despite having her morals and despite having the things that we understood were key aspects of Belinda. So then at the end of the season, when she has gone against those key morals and has chosen to follow her want, we feel a little unsatisfied. Because on one hand, we're like, yeah, she deserves that money. Tanya didn't give it to her. She got screwed in the first season. She's been waiting for something to go her way. She absolutely deserves to not get totally screwed. We still feel at odds. We feel disconnected. And that's because she never fulfilled her need to ground herself, to get back to center, to figure out a new set of priorities, to do all the things that she had said she was looking to accomplish from her time at this White Lotus transfer situation. Instead, she got her initial want, she got the money, and she headed out, and she forgot to satisfy any of her needs. So these, as I said, are very common in the White Lotus. We see all the time that we see what a character needs and we watch them follow their want. In the first season, Alexandra Daddario's character, we know that she should not be with that guy. We know he is bad for her, but we watch her wanting the life he provides and she chooses to stay with him at the end of the season. In season 2, the couples, the two couples, they all should not be together. They need to grow on their own. They need to solve themselves. They need to go on a lot of self-work journeys. And in the end, they want their status quo. They like the way that things are, and they're choosing to keep it the same at the end of the season. So essentially, they leave unchanged. And that to me is one of the biggest themes of the White Lotus that season 3 still very much accomplishes. It makes us reflect on the fact that we thought these people were going to go through these massive internal journeys and leave changed because we feel changed having watched them. And yet their own egos, their own attachment to the material, their own inability to quantify what had happened or take it in and allow it to be a change that they could reflect on means that they leave this trip relatively unchanged. And that ultimately is one of the biggest commentaries is, are these people capable of changing, or has their wealth, has their status, has their preconceived notions about the way the world works prevented them from being able to do that? So I think a lot of that was deliberate. But I would love if anyone else has opinions on these things, thinks that some of these were deliberate, can shed some more light on some of my analyses of it, or just tell me if it felt satisfying to you, it felt unsatisfying to you. I'd love to hear your opinions. I think this show is awesome, and I think that there are very few shows that are on air right now that can trigger this level of debate, and ultimately that's one of my favorite things about media. So let me know your thoughts. Let's talk about it more.